I also want to acknowledge and start by acknowledging where I am and who I am. My name is Mandeep Kaur Mucina, as Andrea said, and I live on the unceded Lekwungen territories. I'm a grateful visitor on the Wasanich, Songhees, and the Esquimalt nations, who are the original caretakers of these beautiful lands and waters. I'm grateful to be working and raising my children on these territories. And I want to start my talk by recognizing that my occupation of these lands may contribute to Indigenous people's fight for sovereignty and governance. So each time I share this acknowledgement, I'm vocalizing my commitment towards decolonization and solidarity with Indigenous communities across this nation. And I invite listeners to do the same in their own lives, setting their intentions for living as visitors on these lands. So I'm going to be sharing a bunch of stories today. And I hope that through the sharing of stories, we can find some meaning in what an underdog is. I was born and raised on Cowichan territory as the first generation of my immigrant family. And I've had the wonderful privilege of moving across Turtle Island throughout my adult life. From Musqueam territory, where I worked as a child protection worker, to Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee territories, also known as Toronto, where I completed my graduate work in social work and PhD in adult education. Finally, I lived and worked in Mi'kmaq territory, also known as Halifax, where I was teaching in the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. I'm grateful to all the teachings I gained in my time on Turtle Island, and I don't think I could be here doing this work if I didn't take time to recognize the gifts I received across this nation. So as a child, my father and grandmother often emphasized to my siblings and I that we were visitors here. This is not our traditional territory. They taught me early on that we come from northern India, from the Galua tribe in Himachal Pradesh, which is the most northern province in India. My father particularly emphasized that over there was home, and over here I'll always be a visitor. And I was often reminded of my immigrant status, not from the first peoples of this land or Indigenous communities, but often by entitled settlers and by what Bell Hooks often calls heteropatriarchy and white supremacy, that saw my body, my brown body, as the other in colonized spaces. So these early experiences of living as a marked body shaped my life, and I constantly negotiated the spaces that I enter and exit as a result. The spaces I navigate never imagined this particular body when they were created. And I'll come back to this concept as I go through this talk. So as a child, this orientation confused me. Yet I came to appreciate my complicated subject vocation as I grew older. I continue to complicate the notion that India can still be considered home, as I'm not recognized as a native over there either. The search for home is not a new concept. Many scholars that I admire have talked about this, like Sarah Ahmed, Avtar Bra, and Himani Banerjee, who speak about the complicated ways in which racialized bodies call this place home. Yet the search for home is a part of my narrative, and the narrative for many young children and youth who migrate here or are born to immigrant families. And these stories of home situate my entry into the world as they do my research and community work with Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. So I'm hoping to share my story and journey this morning. And the story is about boundaries that shape movements and how to transgress, resist, and reshape those boundaries through acts of witnessing, stories, art, and most importantly, relationships. In my story and my work, you might hear visions of a future. What happens when we speak back to colonialism that never imagined our bodies in the spaces we transgress? And I hope to do this by sharing 3 distinct moments in my life that speak to how I transgressed boundaries and made space to witness the stories of other transgressors. And together we created powerful transformative spaces. So let's go together on a few stories. Stories are important. Thomas King talks about this very eloquently. And if you haven't read his work, he's amazing. Stories are who we are. It's what we're drawn to and how we can see the world in transformative ways. The truth about stories is that that's all we are. I'm drawn to listening and sharing stories. I see my story and physical embodiment in colonized spaces, such as academia, which is where I'm at right now, as an act of resistance. My embodiment of that space is a radical act, and I use my body and position to smuggle in other resistors, to transform education through stories, art, and relational practices. I hope my story will stir a story inside of you, all of you who have chosen to share your morning with me, and perhaps we'll see each other in new ways. Before I begin, I have to say I feel a little bit like a fish out of water because I've never seen myself as an artist. Even the word underdog feels a bit foreign to me. But what I've always been really great at is seeing people and witnessing their humanity. For me, this is the most beautiful visual. And through relational practices, I have throughout my life brought together stories and art to transgress how we see each other in the world. So I'm going to start with my childhood, which can feel a bit daunting, but stay with me here. I am the second child born to my family. My brother came a year and a half before me, but honestly, I don't know a world without him in it. My sister came 6 years after me, and when I was a child, I saw her coming into the world as a response to multiple requests I made to the universe. We all grew up in a small village on Vancouver Island among other Punjabi families who had migrated to these lands as early as 1914 to work for settler colonial agents in this greedy resource extraction projects. I could talk a lot about the history of brown bodies being used as in a larger colonial project that has led to the depletion of life, land, and water, a project that Indigenous communities have been fighting and resisting since settler occupation of these lands. But that's another story, another presentation, and I won't go into detail about it today. But if you're interested, there are many books I can direct you towards and many efforts that you can support right now that are fighting for Indigenous sovereignty every day. #Wet'suwet'en. So my father broke his body as a laborer in the lumber industry and was wounded every day by racist encounters with blue-collar settlers who didn't always see his humanity when they worked beside or above him. My mother tilled farms, weakened her knees and calloused her hands, which were stained red and blue and bled from the berries she picked for 20 years in the summer months. As a child, I was encouraged to pursue a simple education so that I could live a comfortable life, raise a family, and only bring my family honor. I didn't know I wanted more, yet I found myself moving past the comfortable, always striving for a road less traveled by my family. What a difficult and terrifying thing for my parents to witness. I realized that these spaces were not where my family ever imagined their daughter entering, as they had never been within reach for them. My childhood in this blue-collar mill town was filled with free-range parenting, where I ran through the towering trees that lined our streets, swimming at the lake and going to the temple with a community of Punjabi Sikhs who all had the wonderful pleasure of raising me. But it's also full of shame and difficult moments, of witnessing racism against my parents and community and experiencing microaggressions every day. My way to cope was to stay as quiet as a mouse and to bring as little attention to myself as possible. But I did start transgressing boundaries, but only in my home. And even these were small acts of resistance, such as cutting my hair without my father's permission, wearing lipstick as a teenager, and finding ways to express myself through my clothes. These may not seem like significant acts of resistance for many, but for my family, these were signs that my parents were losing their children to a Western world they didn't understand. My parents are children born at the brink of independence from British colonialism. Our culture, Indigenous ways of knowing the world, and religion are the most significant parts of their identity they fought hard to hold on to, and they were unwilling to let go of any of it here or let their children lose it. I understand this now, but at the time, these acts felt very confining. So my quiet revolution was all I had. I needed to survive and find a way out of the confines of racism, sexism, and my family's honor that I had somehow held precariously in my body and my actions. However, my biggest transgressions involved living in multiple worlds that my family had no idea I was living. Some would call this lying to my parents or my family. However, as second-generation South Asian women, we see this as navigation as a way to protect ourselves and our families. Which brings me to my second story. In the summer months of 2003, Amandeep Atwal was stabbed by her father multiple times. The headlines were devastating. Amandeep did what many of us do. She dated in secrecy. However, she went on to do something brave, or what I thought at the time was quite foolish, which was to tell her family about her secret boyfriend, leading to her death at the hands of her father. See, I was also holding a secret, and I thought it was foolish that she came forward with it. These stories brought up past stories of suicide, murder, domestic violence of young women in the Punjabi community. Jesse Sidhu's story was conjured in the media and the Punjabi community, and honor killings became a source of fascination for dominant media. But when I heard Amandeep's story, it was reaching a little too close for home for me. I was living multiple lives without my family's knowledge. I was in a relationship with a Black man who's now my life partner and the father of my 2 children. But at the time, I kept the relationship a secret for years. I knew once I came out to my family, we would all encounter difficult consequences and choices, and I was not ready to face them. My choices to keep my life outside my family hidden was deeply connected to my family's honor, a cultural construct we call in Punjabi as Izzat. Izzat, or honor, is this invisible thread that connects me to my family, and our actions can have ripple effects that impact everyone. And sometimes it can go beyond family, intimate, private families, but families that are connected to us by communities. I see Izzat as a moral code that keeps us connected and accountable to our family and community. It's so hard to define this concept in English that is so confining to particular ways of seeing the world. And if you come from a collectivist worldview, this concept may be easier to grasp. But ultimately, every time I make a choice, I'm carrying the reputation of my family on my shoulders. Over the years, unfortunately, heteropatriarchy has transformed Izzat from a collective tool of violence against women and girls. Amandeep's death was called an honor killing in the media. She had transgressed perceived boundaries within her family, boundaries that were shrouded in honor and upheld through guilt and shame. Eventually, I did come out to my family as well about my secrets and my relationship. And for a long while, I was asked to leave my family and community. Sometimes I call this an excommunication, and other times I think of myself as being part of the living dead, where my father no longer saw me as a daughter, alive or dead. Sarah Ahmed describes us as feminist killjoys. She says a feminist killjoy is a woman who is willing to go against the social order, which is protected as a moral order, a happiness order. It's to be willing to cause unhappiness, even if unhappiness is not your cause. To be willing to cause unhappiness might be how we live an individual life. Not to choose the right path is readable as giving up the happiness that is presumed to follow that path. In many ways, I was the source of my family's unhappiness by choosing a path that would lead me to exile and separation from the only source of support I had ever known. To transgress boundaries is to question the morals and social order that has created boundaries in the first place. I left Vancouver and I moved to Toronto to give my partner and I a chance to be free from the emotional impact of losing my family. I was grieving and the loss was devastating. But I started my master's degree soon after. And it was through education, research, and reaching out to others who had stories of honor that I found some strength. Which leads me to my third story. And I call this entering academia or witnessing resistance. So my parents didn't pursue education beyond grade 10. And with their heavy accents, they navigated white spaces with a sense of uncertainty. I witnessed all my life, and I witnessed it with sometimes guilt and shame. Each time I moved from one degree to the next, I told myself, this is as far as I would go, because I come from a long line of ancestors who labored with their hands, not their minds. Yet, here I am. My route to academia has never been linear, nor was it always in my trajectory to be the first in both my family lines to move this far in a formal educational setting. Being a professor is a role I must balance with great humility and responsibility. I carry these stories with me every time I enter the institution, yet they're not written on my body or in my CV. What is the story behind the titles? I came to research and writing because of a deep pain and hurt I was feeling, similar to what Bell Hooks also speaks about. She says, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory because desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I turned to writing and research as a way to move through my pain. And I used grad school as a vehicle to do that. I started my first journey into research in my master's degree, where I looked deeply into the colonial history of violence on my community and the intergenerational trauma of my parents' generation, who carried some of their pains from a post-colonial India to the diaspora. At the time, I was working as a violence against women counselor with immigrant and refugee women. I found this work to be incredibly humbling. The woman I worked with taught me to listen and respond rather than to search for answers to the violence they were encountering and to their complex lives. They taught me that they were the best source of knowledge when it came to surviving violence. And then in the winter of 2007, Aksa Parvez was murdered by her father and brother, and the city of Toronto was shaking with what her death meant. The media was eager to call her death an honor killing and to name her religion, culture, parents, and community as barbaric. Many of us in Toronto were pushing back against these constructions of our communities, yet often felt like we were talking more to ourselves than to the public. They were unwilling to listen or believe us. I was being drawn back to my school, and I needed to write about how my story was connected to Amandeep Atwal, to Jussie Sidhu, and now to Aksa Parvez, and to so many other women in the diaspora who were sitting with similar stories. Women who, like me, were the living dead, exiled from their families and communities because of transgressing perceived boundaries of izzat or honor in their family. I was searching for women that went against the social order, both inside their family and in dominant society. I'm getting emotional, which is strange because it's been a while, but you never know how these things trigger. You see, even though we were exiled, these women and I, from the womb of our families, our navigations in public spaces, white spaces, didn't come with welcoming arms. We encountered culturally racist responses when we shared our stories that frame our families as backward and unwilling to modernize or assimilate. As I share this, I'm reminded every time that I share my story how risky it is to do this in public domains, as my story and the stories I've witnessed sit on this thin line where they can be taken up to validate these racist beliefs that create these binaries and search for a victim and a perpetrator. This is really easy to do. I've done it. I've seen others do it. And we've been taught these tropes early on. And I encourage you to resist these moves. I'm not a victim of anything, and I have deep respect for my family and community who cannot be simplified through these lenses. I found many Punjabi sisters living in exile, and together we shared our stories, which became a part of my dissertation. Through research, writing, gathering, eating delicious food, and drinking copious amounts of tea, we found each other's pain. We saw each other, and we saw each other's pain and capacity to resist. I realized that through witnessing their individual stories, we were creating something powerful with each other. We were validating each other's journeys and the difficult choices we made, the pain our families encountered, and what others could never understand. Together, we wrote a collective poem in the form of an open letter, and this expression of creativity will connect us forever. So for me, research and community work must include witnessing people's survival stories. It must include creative forms of sharing our stories beyond defining women as needing to be saved, but as sources of strength, survival, and resistance. I search for others who transgress boundaries in their everyday lives, and often they find me. When they do find me, I validate their transgressions with love, dignity, and deep respect, not with shame or guilt. Again, I could go on about the practice of this work and the importance of doing that and how difficult it can be because we've been taught to only do quite the opposite in many ways. But that's also another presentation. So some concluding thoughts and some questions for you to consider. Earlier, I talked about this idea of imagined communities that Benedict Anderson put in his work very early on in the 80s, I think. And I am fascinated by how nations are socially constructed and imagined by the people who see themselves in that construction. This concept engages with notions of nationalism and the construction of state societies, where spaces, places, and institutions are created with a particular body in mind. I know my body was not imagined in academia. I'm too brown, and I'm a woman, and my worldview is not validated in these spaces. But I'm here. And in my time so far, I focus my energy in bringing together Black, Indigenous, racialized women to share their stories and create art that can shift and transform these imagined colonized colonial spaces. I've been part of 2 incredible mural projects in the last 2 years, and both were a collaboration with Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women in particular on a global scale. And they're based on a transformative methodology created by an incredible artist named Shiloh Shiv Suleiman, and she called her collective the Fearless Collective, and is based out of Bangalore, India. And I can offer the link if folks are interested in looking at their work, because it's beautiful. I can't even express in words the beauty that it emulates. The vision of the Fearless Collective is to move stories and visions for a future from fear to love through co-creation of beauty in public spaces. And we did that very thing. We created a mural on Esquimalt territories, a collaboration between Black, Indigenous, and women of color. And we created another one that now lives in the University of Victoria Library. I saw my role in this work as a connector and organizer, allowing for incredible artists like Shiloh and local Indigenous artists like Nicole Neidhart, Brianna Dick, and Anna Chadwick to come together to create these incredible murals. Both murals were co-created with women and resist and transgress boundaries, coming together and witnessing each other's stories, tears, and beauty. So my vision is to continue finding others who transgress boundaries, regardless of the consequences, and to witness their journeys. And I'm incredibly honored to do this work, and I'm a gift that I'm grateful for every day, and I love what I do. So I am grateful for all of you to joining me this morning and listening to my story. I welcome you to share your stories now, and I'd love to hear how you've pushed, transgressed, or transformed the boundaries that shape your lives. What is your greatest contribution to transforming the social order? Thank you.